The morning I stepped outside and saw empty space where my new car should have been. Something inside me shifted in a way I did not understand yet, because it was not only shock or fear that settled in my chest, but a quiet, crawling realization that the people closest to me already knew why it was gone. The driveway looked normal. At first glance, clean concrete, early sunlight stretching across the quiet suburban street, birds moving between trees as if nothing had happened overnight. Yet the absence screamed louder than any alarm ever could, because I had parked my car there less than 12 hours earlier, carefully, proudly, with the kind of satisfaction that comes after years of discipline and sacrifice, finally turns into something real you can touch. As I stood there frozen, my mind did not jump to random criminals or bad luck, because deep down I already felt the shape of betrayal forming, heavy and familiar, the kind that only family can deliver with precision. I am Hannah, and until that morning, I believed success would eventually earn me respect, even inside my own family. But that belief died the same night my car vanished without a trace. I had bought that car for myself after years of choosing responsibility over comfort, patience over impulse, and silence over explanation, building my career quietly while everyone around me measured life by what they could take instead of what they could build. I lived alone in a quiet American neighborhood where people waved politely and minded their own business, a place I chose because it felt safe, controlled, predictable, and far away from the emotional chaos I grew up with. Yet even distance had not protected me from what was coming. My parents, George and Elaine, lived less than 20 minutes away, close enough to stay involved in my life without truly knowing me, close enough to feel entitled to my achievements without understanding the work behind them, and close enough to watch everything I earned with a hunger they never bothered to hide. George had always believed that children owed their parents forever, not emotionally but financially, as if love were an investment meant to pay dividends, and my independence offended him in ways he never said out loud, but made clear through disappointment that lingered in every interaction. My mom, Elaine, was quieter, colder, a woman who rarely raised her voice, yet mastered the art of silent judgment. Her concern always wrapped in subtle reminders that I was doing too well for someone who never asked permission. Then there was my cousin Ryan, the one who paid attention to details others ignored, the one who noticed brands, prices, upgrades, and timing, the one whose smile never reached his eyes when he congratulated me on anything. Ryan had always struggled financially, but what weighed heavier on him was not lack of money. It was resentment, because he believed life owed him comfort without effort, and my success felt like proof that the world had chosen the wrong person to reward. The night before the car disappeared, I remember standing in my driveway for a moment longer than necessary, my hand resting on the door handle, feeling a quiet pride mixed with caution, because success inside a jealous family never feels fully safe. I had posted nothing online, told almost no one, and yet by the next morning, the car was gone so cleanly that it felt rehearsed, as if someone had known exactly when to act, how long they had, and how to leave nothing behind. As panic tried to rise, it was replaced by something colder, something sharper, because my thoughts did not scatter. They aligned, pointing inward toward memories I had ignored for too long. Moments where money had entered conversations disguised as jokes, where expectations had been framed as concern, and where my boundaries had been treated like temporary obstacles. I thought about how George had recently ask questions about my schedule, questions that felt casual but landed with strange precision, and how Elaine had gone quiet when I refused to help with money yet again, her silence stretching longer than usual, heavier than before. I thought about Ryan's sudden interest in my neighborhood, the way his eyes lingered on the driveway, the last time he visited, calculating instead of admiring, measuring instead of celebrating. Standing there alone, phone heavy in my hand, I realized the theft was not just about a car. It was a message, a punishment disguised as crime, a way to remind me that my success had made me a target inside my own bloodline. When the police became involved, the situation shifted from personal violation to something far more dangerous for those who are responsible, because investigations do not care about family dynamics, emotions, or unspoken expectations. They care about patterns, access, and motive. Detective Samuel would later become the calm presence that slowly unraveled everything, but at that moment, before any official process began, I already felt the direction this would go. Because lies built on jealousy always leave fingerprints, even when professionals are hired to do the dirty work. What unsettled me most was not the loss itself, but how quickly my grief transformed into clarity. Because once trust is broken at this level, survival demands strategy instead of emotion. I knew then that the people who believed they were punishing me had underestimated one crucial detail: the fact that I pay attention when things stop adding up. And I never forget the moment someone crosses from family into enemy. As the sun rose higher and neighbors began their routines, I stepped back inside, closing the door slowly. Not in defeat, but in preparation. Because whatever they thought they had taken from me overnight was only the beginning of what they were about to lose. And while the empty driveway looked like the end of something, I already sensed it was the opening move in a chain of consequences none of them were ready to face. After closing the door behind me that morning, I did not allow myself the comfort of denial, because denial only works when betrayal is accidental. And this felt calculated, timed, and personal in a way that stripped innocence from every possibility. I moved through my house slowly, noticing how quiet everything felt, without the usual sense of security, as if the walls themselves understood that something had been taken that could not be replaced by insurance forms or polite apologies. What stayed with me most was not the missing car itself, but the absence of surprise in my own reaction, because deep down I had already been preparing for this moment, without realizing it, collecting emotional evidence long before physical proof ever appeared. The report was filed, the process began, and the situation officially entered the hands of law enforcement, which marked the first shift in power that none of my family members could control or manipulate the way they were used to doing with me. Detective Samuel approached the case with a calm intensity that made it clear this was not his first experience with crimes that hid behind family connections. And while I did not hear his thoughts directly, I could feel the weight of his attention settling on details that others might dismiss. As days passed, routines became strained, and every interaction with my family carried an undercurrent of performance, because people hiding something often overact normalcy, mistaking noise for camouflage. George checked in more than usual, his concern arriving late and landing awkwardly, as if he were following a script, rather than responding to genuine worry. And the timing alone raised more questions than comfort. Elaine's silence became heavier, her absence louder than words, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, measured, and defensive rather than empathetic. Ryan's presence shifted subtly, his confidence dimming just enough to suggest awareness, not of guilt yet, but of risk, which told me more than any confession ever could. As the investigation unfolded, patterns began to surface, not through dramatic revelations, but through the slow accumulation of facts that refused to stay buried, especially when greed is involved. The theft had been clean, professional, and efficient, which immediately narrowed the scope, because random crimes rarely operate with that level of precision, and personal crimes rarely leave no emotional residue. What mattered most was access. And access always starts with information, meaning someone had known my schedule, my habits, and the exact window of opportunity needed to make the disappearance look effortless. I realized then that the car had not vanished overnight. It had been removed deliberately, as part of a plan that required patience, trust, and inside knowledge. That understanding reframed everything, because it meant this was not about desperation alone, but about entitlement, the belief that my belongings were available for redistribution once my refusal to share money became inconvenient. As financial motives surfaced quietly in the investigation, the pressure began to tighten around those closest to me, because resentment leaves trails in bank records, phone logs, and associations that no amount of family loyalty can erase. Ryan's financial situation became relevant in ways he had likely never anticipated, because people who believe they deserve more than they earn often take risks that expose them to scrutiny they are unprepared for. The involvement of a professional thief, once considered a distant possibility, became a central focus because professionals do not work without payment, and payment always leaves evidence, whether through intermediaries or desperation-driven mistakes. At the same time, my own emotional state shifted from loss to observation, because grief had already done its worst, and what remained was a sharp clarity that allowed me to see my family not as parents and relatives, but as suspects reacting under pressure. George's pride began to crack under the weight of external authority, because he had built his sense of control within the safety of family dynamics, never imagining those dynamics would collapse once legal accountability entered the picture. Elaine's quiet compliance, once her greatest weapon, turned into a liability, because silence draws attention when explanations are expected. And Ryan, who had always believed himself clever, underestimated one thing that would ultimately undo him: the patience of investigators who do not rush conclusions but wait for inconsistencies to reveal themselves naturally. As the investigation deepened, I became aware of how much my family had underestimated me, not just financially, but emotionally, assuming that fear would silence me and loyalty would protect them. What they did not understand was that my silence had never been weakness. It had been restraint, and restraint disappears the moment survival demands honesty. The emotional distance between us widened rapidly, not because I pushed them away, but because truth has a way of isolating those who rely on deception to stay connected. I felt moments of sadness, not for the betrayal itself, but for the realization that my success had become a threat rather than a source of shared pride, turning family into competitors instead of supporters. As small details aligned, the case shifted from uncertain to inevitable, because once motives align with opportunity and behavior changes under scrutiny, conclusions stop being speculative. The realization that my parents were not just aware, but complicit arrived quietly, like a door closing softly behind me, final and irreversible. It became clear that this was never just Ryan's plan, but a collective decision rooted in resentment, framed as fairness, and justified through the belief that I had more than I deserved. What unsettled me most was not the theft itself, but how easily love had been replaced with calculation, how quickly family loyalty had dissolved into transactional thinking. By the time the investigation reached a critical stage, the emotional damage had already been done. Because even before legal consequences arrived, trust had been permanently dismantled. I understood then that whatever happened next would not restore what was lost, but it would establish boundaries that could never be crossed again. As pressure mounted, the cracks widened, and I sensed that the people who believed they were smarter than the system were about to learn how unforgiving truth can be when it finally surfaces. And while the stolen car had been the trigger, it was no longer the focus, because the real loss they were about to experience had nothing to do with vehicles or money, and everything to do with freedom, reputation, and control. By the end of that week, the investigation had reached a point where outcomes were no longer flexible, and the sense of inevitability settled in quietly, signaling that the final chapter was approaching, faster than any of them expected. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, the emotional distance between me and my family had already hardened into something unrecognizable. Because once betrayal is exposed under legal light, it stops being personal and starts becoming permanent. I could feel the shift before anything official happened. The subtle change in how pressure moved through the situation, no longer circling possibilities, but closing in on conclusions that could not be negotiated or softened by excuses. What became clear was how fragile their confidence truly was, because people who believe family will protect them often forget that law does not recognize emotional history, only evidence, patterns, and intent. The professional theft once meant to shield them from direct involvement became the very thread that unraveled everything, because professionals leave trails when desperation drives decisions, and desperation had guided every step of this plan. Financial records aligned, timelines collapsed into each other, and associations surfaced with an accuracy that left no room for reinterpretation, exposing how Ryan had arranged the theft while relying on my parents to provide access, information, and justification. The realization that George and Elaine had supported the plan not out of fear, but out of entitlement, struck deeper than any loss of property, because it confirmed that love had been replaced with resentment the moment my success stopped benefiting them. As the investigation concluded, the illusion of control they had clung to began to disintegrate rapidly, replaced by a panic that could no longer be hidden behind silence or authority. I watched the process unfold from a distance, not emotionally detached, but emotionally resolved. Because once truth reaches this stage, involvement becomes observation rather than participation. The consequences arrived without drama, without the kind of confrontation people imagine, because real accountability is often quiet, procedural, and devastating in its finality. Ryan's confidence collapsed first, exposed by evidence he never believed would surface, leaving him unable to escape the reality that cleverness without discipline always ends the same way. George's authority disintegrated next, stripped of relevance the moment legal responsibility replaced parental dominance, revealing how powerless control becomes once it loses its emotional leverage. Elaine's silence, which had once protected her, offered no refuge now. Because neutrality is not innocence when actions support harm, and complicity does not disappear simply because it remains unspoken. The arrests marked the end of any illusion that this was a misunderstanding, transforming family betrayal into documented crime, with consequences measured in years rather than apologies. Knowing they would face jail, time did not bring me joy in the way revenge stories often promise, but it brought something far more valuable, a restoration of dignity, safety, and clarity that no amount of emotional closure could replace. What satisfied me most was not seeing them punished, but knowing that the system they believed they could manipulate had refused to bend for them, treating their actions with the same weight it would give to strangers. The car, once central to everything, became irrelevant because the true cost of their actions had nothing to do with material loss and everything to do with irreversible damage to their futures. As the legal process concluded, my role shifted from victim to survivor, and eventually to someone who no longer carried the burden of family expectations disguised as obligation. I felt grief, not for the relationship itself, but for the version of family I had once hoped could exist, a version that had never truly been real. What replaced that grief was a calm strength, grounded in the knowledge that boundaries enforced through action are the only ones that last. The community that once saw us as connected now saw consequences instead, and reputation, once damaged by whispers, was restored through truth. I reclaimed my sense of safety not through confrontation, but through justice, allowing the law to do what emotional reasoning never could. Looking back, I understood that the theft had never been about the car, but about control, resentment, and punishment for independence, and those motives had ultimately destroyed the very people who believed they were entitled to my success. What they lost was not just freedom, but access to my life, my trust, and any future where family could be used as leverage. I walked away from the experience without bitterness, but with clarity, knowing that love without respect is a liability, not a bond. The silence that followed felt different from before, no longer heavy or manipulative, but peaceful, earned, and protective. If there is one lesson this experience carved into me permanently, it is that jealousy turns family into strangers faster than distance ever could. And success must be guarded not just from outsiders, but from those who feel entitled to it. So I ask you this, because it matters more than any ending. If the people closest to you crossed a line that could never be erased, would you protect the idea of family? Or would you protect yourself when it mattered most?